Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and good morning in the United States. Welcome to our panel discussion titled Mushrooming Anti-NGO Legislation in EU Member States and Its Implications, the Cases of Hungary and Slovakia. My name is Daniel Hegedűs. I work as Regional Director for Central Europe at the German Marshall Fund. And usually this is the point where I would say that I am pleased or delighted to moderate today's event, but I'm afraid there won't be much that's really pleasing or delightful in our discussion. The United States' retreat from its former role as guardian of democracy has contributed to an accelerated autocratization of illiberal regimes both within and outside of the European Union. It has fostered an emboldening international environment in which illiberal governments that are facing domestic pressure are increasingly inclined to deploy authoritarian measures to suppress political opposition, critical civil society, or independent media. The arrest of Istanbul Mayor Ekrem İmamoğlu and the raids on civil society organizations' offices in Belgrade, Serbia, are driven by the same logic as the recent anti-NGO legislation introduced in EU member states of Hungary and Slovakia. They only represent different stages of authoritarian repression. Both pieces of legislation under discussion today are practically historic milestones. The Slovak law is the first dedicated legal instrument aimed at systematically discouraging civic activism, infringing on freedom of association, and creating a chilling effect on civil society since the country joined the European Union in 2004. Moreover, it also constitutes the second national legislative framework within the EU that pursues these above objectives, which highlights that anti-NGO legislation is no longer a uniquely Hungarian issue, but rather a transnational phenomenon that is shaped by learning among illiberal elites. And as such, it has a contagious effect in the EU. If one illiberal government is able to get away with authoritarian moves more or less unchallenged and unharmed, then others will most likely follow suit. And since 2017, the Hungarian parliament has passed at least 4 laws that can be classified as anti-NGO legislation. However, the draft law on the transparency of public life, which is now in the legislative pipeline, marks a Rubicon. If enacted, it would prohibit civil society organizations critical of the government, including those advocating women's rights or LGBTQ rights, as well as independent media outlets, from receiving any form of international support, including the official programs of the European Commission, like the Citizens' Equality, Rights and Values. The operational environment for civil society in Hungary, in that case, would differ little from that in countries like Azerbaijan or Belarus, except in the absence of politically motivated arrest or physical violence, at least for now. With that context in mind, I am truly honored to introduce our distinguished speakers who will guide us through this very critical and gloomy discussion. Katarina Batkova, Director of Via Juris, one of Slovakia's leading human rights watchdogs. Marta Pardavi, co-chair of the Hungarian Helsinki Foundation, and Professor Erdaniel Kelemen, McCourt Chair at Georgetown University in the United States. Regarding the housekeeping rules, we will begin with an approximately 45 minutes discussion on the 2 cases and their broader European implications, and that will be followed by a Q&A session. Ladies and gentlemen, you are welcome to submit your questions anytime using the Q&A function of Zoom, and we will incorporate your questions into the discussion. I also would like to remind you that the event is being recorded and will be made available online on the YouTube channel of the German Marshall Fund and of our Horizon project, Outlib, which is the co-host of today's event. And going in chronological order, the Slovak National Council passed the above-mentioned law on April 17. And somewhat surprisingly, and at least that was my personal impression, the case remained largely underreported in the international media, especially considering its significance. Katarina, could you help us to understand the content and the relevance of the law and how it might affect Slovak civil society once implemented. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me to this panel. I will speak about the Slovakian case. For first, let's say that the original legislation on freedom of association has number 83 from 1990. So it was one of the first legislation adopted after the Velvet Revolution, in that time Czechoslovakia. So this legislation was not drastically changed until now, April 2025. And I will speak firstly about the current situation, the current legislation, and from Sunday, the June 1st, the new legislation will came into force, and what changes this legislation will bring in my second part. Firstly, about 80,000 organizations are registered in Slovakia in 5 legal different forms. Most common, about 85% of them are civic organizations. These changes to regulation on the NGOs in Slovakia will concern mostly these civic organizations, which until now didn't have an obligation under the legislation to have an annual report published, or don't have any obligation to disclose the financing at all. But on the other hand, there were some other obligations that were concerning these NGOs. In reality, most of the NGOs, also civic organizations which were operating in Slovakia, actually were willingly publishing their annual reports, and there were also other obligations under this transparency. Slovakia has obligation to publish all the contracts that were contracted between public institutions and any other private entities in its register. So all the contracts that were signed between the institutions of a state or local governments and the NGOs were already published. And also we have a mechanism of tax assignation, and the NGOs which are receiving money from this tax assignation mechanism over 3,030 euros per year must publish annually how they use the money. So there were quite a lot of transparency in using the public funds in Slovakia, but not towards the private one concerning the civic organizations. All the other legal forms of the NGOs already had an obligation to publish the annual reports. So there were lots of transparency in the NGO sector until now. But the government came up with this narrative that there is not enough transparency and we need a new legislation. As a watchdog organizations, we were in somehow trying to bring more transparency, and we were proposing some changes to these obligations. So some of the NGOs will have the obligation to publish the annual reports. But now the threshold, which was introduced by this new legislation, is very low. So every organization which have income over 35,000 euros per year must now oblige with this new transparency legislation. What I wanted to touch is the process. The process of adopting this new legislation in Slovakia started a year ago. So in April 2024, and the first initial draft was concerning these NGOs were on labeling the NGOs. The first draft introduced the labeling organizations receiving money from abroad as organizations with the foreign support, and also introduced lots of penalties, even the dissolution of organization without decision of a court, but so by only administrative decision by the Ministry of Interior. Secondly, in November 2024, this legislation was amended with another twist, introducing labeling organizations as lobbyists. And this was not approved, but the initial draft amendment also came with a labeling only to the NGOs when the NGOs were engaged in actually any public appearance. So even a Facebook social media status can be concerned as a lobbying activity. And also this amendment introduced lots of reporting obligations towards the NGOs and also the penalties, including the dissolution with an administrative decision of the Ministry of Interior. What was really harmful for NGOs in Slovakia was the public debate around this legislation. So for 1 year, we need to run campaigns against this legislation. We were threatened by the politicians. We were attacked by the politicians. Particular organizations like concrete organizations were under attack, or the civic sector as such. And so the result was that the politicians finally withdraw any labeling from the anti-NGO legislation, which was drafted, which was approved at the end. So there is no labeling of the organization, but it still comes with several different administrative obligations that the NGOs will need to oblige with or comply with. The first is that the organization will need to prepare and publish accounting statements. These statements will include income and expenses categorized by sources. There will be an obligation to publish any income from the companies or donors, and they will need to publish also donations from physical persons when these donations exceed or are over 5,000 euros per year. So not only the company donors, but also the physical persons. And separately, we need to disclose all money coming from outside the EU and the money that will be used outside the EU countries. Secondly, we will need to disclose the members of our organs within the organizations. So some kind of list of names, people who are engaged in the organization more than just normal members. Secondly, the big difference is the scope of control that can be used to control these statements. The Ministry of Interior or the district offices will have an evaluation power, not controlling just what is wrong and what is right, but they will need to evaluate these statements. And in this evaluation process, they can demand any other things, supporting documents, all the other administrative decisions, and also a private donor's data to prove that these statements are right or false. And if the organization will not comply or will not cooperate with this administrative evaluation process, there will be penalties put on these organizations, put on these NGOs, but there is no right to dissolute organization from not complying within the process. So this is something that the government withdraw from. And I think the most threatening part now is that the parliament approved that the organization operating in the civic sector will need to answer questions from public concerning the usage of the public funds under an Access to Information Act. So like the public institutions, like the local governments, also the NGOs will have an obligation to answer any questions coming from general public. And actually the legislation is so unclear there is not a clear definition of which of the organizations will be obliged to answer, because the criteria are uncertain. And also the process of disclosing the information on using of the public funds is unclear. So there is a big threat that NGOs can not easily, breach the legislation. And the actual sanction of breaching this legislation is a punishment, is a penalty, fine actually, towards the statutory representative of the organization. So not the organization as such, but the statutory representatives. What is really concerning us that the legislation is coming into force on 1st of June, because the Constitutional Court today decided that he will not postpone the application of the legislation, even though the Constitutional Court will decide on the constitutionality of this legislation. So he will decide later. But the legislation will come into force, as I said, 1st of June, so on Sunday, and lots of application details for the organizations are unclear, not only according to the Access to Information Act, but also towards what kind of data we need to collect to be able to work on the statements, because the statements will be published only next year. But from the 1st of June, we need to collect data on our donors, and it is unclear what kind of data we need to collect. What registries can we implement in our organization to be able to fill in the statements correctly, because there is no needed other regulation, and we are waiting on it, because the Ministry of Finance actually should issue another complementary legislation on that. And it is so unclear for us that most of the organizations are really struggling with this, how to prepare our organization to application of this legislation. And we don't want to be in the breach of the legislation that the government has approved, but it is so unclear, it is so blurred, that we can easily breach the legislation even without any motivation or actually will to breach it.
Thank you so much, Katharina, for this very detailed overview. I think it's fair to draw the takeaway that I think it's clear what sort of chilling effect actually increased authoritarian burden, legal uncertainty, and putting actually the principles of these organizations under financial liability can really create for civil society. When we move to the case of Hungary, Marty, as mentioned earlier, the draft law on public transparency may actually become the fifth piece of anti-NGO legislation in the country since 2017. What makes this law so exceptional that around 350 Hungarian and European NGOs have written a joint letter to the European Commission calling for the suspension of its implementation through an interim measure if it may come into force? What exactly does the law contain, and how is it expected to impact Hungarian civil society? Over to you.
Thank you very much for the invitation, Daniel, and I'd like to send greetings to everybody who's joined this webinar. As I was listening to the new Slovak legislation and Katarina's description, I was really thinking, I've heard this before. These are the recurring threads. The notions, the formulations are quite similar. And yes, indeed, as you pointed out, Hungarian organizations have been confronted with basically almost all the elements that have been flagged by Katarina in the past 10 plus years. And I'm also quite mindful of the many organizations around the world who are also becoming experts routinely attacked and confronted by civic space pressures through legislative initiatives that are called or headed transparency, but in fact they are shrinking, starving, strangling civil society space. So as I was listening, I was thinking, could it be that there is just a delayed trend reaching the European Union? Hungary might have been the first, but obviously Slovakia is not the only follower, and repressive or restrictive legislation making it harder for civil society organizations to operate is also something that has been proposed in many other member states. Reporting requirements, often with very cumbersome administrative obligations, are a typical tool, but of course there are others, and I can say sadly in Hungary we've seen them all, going from attacks on the legitimacy of organizations, questioning or undermining public support for these organizations, to putting pressures, strain on the resources of these organizations. Yes, this is nothing in a way new. What is new, however, is the underlying idea and the tactics or methods proposed under a new legislative proposal being discussed in the Hungarian parliament. So indeed, we see this as a critical and very dark turning point in Hungary's contemporary history. 2 weeks ago, overnight, an individual Fidesz member of parliament submitted a bill that is called a proposal, a law on the transparency of public life. Overnight, through the motion of a single MP, we've seen this before, of course. This is a method to ensure there would not need to be public consultations held, and people would be caught off guard when a very rapid parliamentary process would then follow. This is indeed what is happening in Hungary, and we're looking at the parliamentary session on June 10 to 12, having a final vote on this clearly very harmful proposal. So we're halfway, 2 weeks after the submission and about 2 weeks before it will be adopted. I think no one is questioning in Hungary that this law will indeed go forward. And the discussions in Parliament, quite rapid, are not bringing so far any sort of hopeful signs that the government, the members of Parliament, who basically now the entire Fidesz fraction has signed up to support this initiative, that they would want to tone down many of the provisions that are clearly not only in breach of certain EU laws or principles, but I think it goes really against the core idea of the European Union. So with this sort of introduction, I'd move to describing what it is now, again, that Hungary is trying to do. The reason why this is a turning point, because we are moving, I think, from a hybrid regime with this legislative proposal into something completely different. What is that completely different? It's hard to tell at the moment, but certainly an authoritarian step into not the unknown, but something that is very resembling of what civil society organizations are facing in Russia or Georgia today. This is clearly, I think, not supported by the majority of Hungarians, who are already evidencing quite a high level of discontent with the government's policies, and are also showing a very high level of support for the European Union membership, and I think democracy as a whole. So Hungarians do not want civil society and free media to be eliminated. However, this is what this proposal in the Hungarian parliament wants to achieve. The way to achieve this is to go beyond labeling and requiring organizations to disclose financial information. Indeed, we've, as Katka, you've pointed out, Hungarian organizations also have had these very detailed requirements for many years. And I think these requirements are, of course, the details and the consequences of failure to comply could be discussed, but I, in general, agree with these requirements. I think it's fair enough. We're using public sources often. We should also be informing the public. In fact, Hungarian civil society organizations have put forward very tangible, concrete proposals on how these requirements could be made to improve real transparency. Instead of lengthy PDFs no one really dares to open, we could have a much better system where citizens could get information, and no one has actually picked up these, I think, quite important ideas over the years. What is happening now is moving beyond labeling. The legislative proposal that we're calling a starve and strangle bill basically targets any kind of entity. So it's not only civil society organizations, but also businesses, media organizations could be affected, universities could be affected, public bodies could be affected, foundations, associations that are working in the entire spectrum of civil society space could even be affected. And in fact, the bottom line is anybody could be affected, and it's meant to be this way, to send out a chilling effect already by having a legislation proposed in Parliament. Organizations of all types are worried and are sounding the alarm bells. Why are they being tackled? The law is built on the quite faulty idea that if you're using foreign sources of revenue in your operations, and you, as an organization, as I said, any type of organization, carry out activities that are basically discussing public issues, such as leading public discourse, trying to influence the will of the voters by discussing issues that are also quite cherry-picked from the list of a lot of ideals and principles and rights in the Hungarian Basic Law, such as the rule of law, or Hungary's relations to other countries. Then if you talk about these issues and portray them in a negative light, or support actions against these values, these are of course very vague terms, then using foreign funds for these activities could render any organization suspect. And they will be, on the proposal of a fairly newly established agency called the Sovereignty Protection Office, they will be listed in a government decree. So the law is built on the idea that organizations that use foreign revenues of any type in the European Union, also including revenues from transactions within the European Union, so not only beyond, but also within, if they use foreign revenues for activities that are meant to influence public life, public thinking, public opinion on, for example, the rule of law, they need to be blacklisted. And the government will draw up a decree, a register, and this is not going to be subject to court challenge. So once an organization is labeled, what happens to it? The onus, the responsibility to take care of the ensuing consequences is pushed into the private sector. Financial institutions, banks will need to monitor every single transaction of the registered entity as if they were carrying out money laundering activities. And if there is a suspicious transaction, the bank will have to flag this to the anti-money laundering authority. This, in the present moment, is the tax office. So basically, once you're blacklisted by the government, your entire financial operations, the transactions will be monitored by a bank, and the tax office will look at it and determine whether you can gain access to these transactions, these revenues. There is a general prohibition on receiving foreign funding for these registered entities. So while it's kind of hard to see how the tax office and the banks would be really able to determine the types and nature of financial transactions, but whatever is deemed suspicious will not be allowed to go forward. And this basically will mean that financial transactions, whether they result from ad revenues from Google ads or from charitable donations, gifts, European Union funding schemes, other public funding schemes, sale of merchandise or of services, doesn't matter. As long as the entity is registered on the government's blacklist, they will not be allowed to have access to these revenues. It will take some time for the tax office to make this determination, so it will effectively slow down the cash flow of organizations, but also will, of course, cut them off from receiving these revenues. So this is for the future. This is the starving part. The strangling part is a provision that already would prohibit registered entities, those on the blacklist, from basically continuing work that they're already doing if those are from foreign funds. Now, there's a lot of debate about how this is supposed to be implemented and understood. Clearly, the idea is not a legal one, not in a sort of substantive sense, a lawful one, but rather it is a political one that is couched in a legal provision. You should stop your work and do something else or not do what you're doing. So it sends out a very chilling message already, even though the parliamentary discussion is still ongoing. The impact of this is that organizations are looking at whether there is any possibility to challenge in Hungarian courts this legislation. And we find from the very weak provisions in the legislative proposal that there is basically no effective remedy against neither the registration, which organizations get on the blacklist, neither against the specific decisions of the tax office that would withhold or prohibit the recipient from receiving the funds. You can go to the Hungarian Supreme Court. It's mandatory to have a lawyer represent you in that procedure, but the Curia will not be able to change the tax office's decision. So it can just tell the tax office to perhaps do its job over again. And the Curia's procedure will not have a suspensive effect. You will not be even able to ask for this. So it's going to be an empty procedure. And I have to say, the Curia has been a subject of a lot of conversation lately. It is one of the key domains of concerns about judicial independence and political capture of a court system today in Hungary. So it is certainly not seen as an effective legal remedy. So basically, we're looking at a scenario that is unfolding very fast, which might actually hit society, not only civil society, but society in general, broadly speaking, within a matter of weeks, and where a lot of organizations who are key to actually providing space for discussion on politics, on current affairs and current issues, on issues that concern Hungarians, about corruption, about the state of the rule of law, about Hungary's place in the European Union, about the actions that the Hungarian government is taking or fails to take or does not want to take to provide Hungarians with a better life in Hungary. Now, these will not be discussed because we might see media outlets that operate mostly in online space lose access to their revenues, lose access to their supporters, because many of them, of course, operate on a subscription or donation basis. And if you look at how you donate or subscribe to any newspaper nowadays or to support any civil society or cause nowadays, of course, you know that you'll be doing this in a digital online form. And even for Hungarians who are giving to these organizations or enter into contracts with them, the law will prescribe a cumbersome, paper-based, old-style procedure that is actually really purposefully off-putting and makes it much harder for organizations to receive even donations or fees, revenues from the Hungarian public. Now, something that I think is you mentioned also, Katka, in Slovakia and around Central Europe has been quite an innovative and important source of revenue for civil society organizations is a tax designation. So Hungarians can also offer to give 1% of their income tax Just now, a few days ago, the income tax filing deadline was over, and many Hungarians, knowing that this law is about to hit us, gave to independent media outlets or civil society organizations their tax designations. When they were doing this, they thought that these organizations might be barred from receiving these revenues next year, but they would still have access to it this year. And so many came out and gave. And all of a sudden, just yesterday, it turns out that in the parliamentary discussions, there is an amendment that would basically retroactively undo the will of these taxpayers and take away the already designated, offered tax donations, and would instead redirect it to a government established foundation that provides medical charitable support to patients. So I think Hungarians are also feeling that they have been completely duped, that through this cynical move, that not only is the Hungarian government telling them that interactions with foreigners, financial transactions on a European market is something that the government could, on a purely arbitrary and political basis, prohibit, but it also takes away their little autonomy that they have when they can designate who the beneficiary of their taxes should be. I think we've seen, yes, Dania, you pointed out, of course, a high level of attention and alarm to this law already. Hundreds of organizations in Hungary are signing a protest, including media outlets and civil society. Hungarians, a few days after the law was proposed in the Hungarian parliament, came out and protested in very high numbers, quite spontaneously, in front of the Hungarian parliament. And of course, European civil society media outlets are mobilizing. But I think we go beyond the usual circle of those concerned. So I note that the Hungarian Federation of Advertisers, for example, has expressed concern, and this is an industry platform. Hungarian lawyers groups have also called into question the entire idea of the law. The Hungarian Bar Association has said that this is, so detrimental to the rule of law. It sends out a very chilling effect or message and effect to businesses in general in Hungary, who have, many of them, experienced that the rule of law system is not as protective to everybody as it should be. And so when you think about the future, the very short-term future of Hungary, once this law is in force, I think we have to see that the level of uncertainty increases, that Hungarian organizations will be blocked from taking part in a European or transnational interactions that result in some sort of fiscal transfers. This also means that apparently the government can designate a discussion that is absolutely needed in a democracy on the state of the country, the state of our democracy, as something unwanted, foreign. The only thing that is missing from this legislation is the word undesirable, something that would basically put the cherry on the cake and completely render this carbon copy of the Russian law. So here we are in Hungary, mobilizing, protesting, advocating, calling on the European Commission, and perhaps we can talk about later what to do. But we also see that the time is running out, and the clock is really ticking. Organizations see a listing by the now infamous Sovereignty Protection Office as imminent. There's been a steady stream of its reporting, smearing organizations and calling into question European Union funding schemes for furthering fundamental rights and rule of law values in Hungary as something that is as if it was alien to our country. And I think just 20 years after Hungary's EU accession, with the number of Hungarians clearly saying we want to be a part of this European, not only Union, but also European community of citizens with the values, with the aspirations. I think this is something that should be watched with alarm, and it can be very easily copied into other legislation. The Slovak already sets a springboard for further repressive steps like this. So everybody should be concerned because the spillover effect, the mimicry is very, very easy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marty, for this highly exhaustive analysis. And I think there are really a lot of, I would say, particular questions related to this law and impact that we need to discuss later. And I also would like to encourage you, ladies and gentlemen, to submit your questions in the Q&A, and we will take them with us in the future part of the conversation. But now, turning to you, Dan. You have been studying the relationship between the European Union and its autocratizing member states now for more than a decade. And you have authored some of the most frequently cited academic papers on the subject. How do you see what kind of threat, if any, do these laws pose to the legal and institutional order of the European Union? So what can be their EU-level impact beyond the obviously highly destructive impact at national level? Over to you. You're muted.
Yeah, there we go. Sorry. Thanks, Daniel. Thanks to the other panelists for very informative updates on the latest developments in Hungary and Slovakia. And yeah, I guess I'll try to step back and give a little bigger picture of where this fits into the whole scheme of the EU and the threats these developments pose for the EU. I mean, I think I'd start with something Marta said, which is that these latest moves, like in Hungary and Slovakia, also signals that these regimes are perhaps moving into something different, a new form of regime that is more openly authoritarian. So as you yourself, Daniel, have written in your work with our old professor Bozoki, basically the situation in the EU is you had these hybrid regimes, sort of hybrid between democracy and authoritarianism, that were somewhat constrained by being EU members. So in other words, the EU put outer bounds on how authoritarian they could become because they didn't want to go so far as to provoke, a big reaction from the EU. And so essentially what we're seeing now is testing the limits of that. How far down the pathway toward full-blown authoritarianism can they go without provoking a kind of reaction that they would find particularly problematic? There's, of course, already been some reaction, which I'll get to with some of Hungary's funds being suspended, but it hasn't proven really hugely problematic for the regime so far. So they're trying to test the bounds. And they're doing this in a context where they feel confident because of the international environment, because Trump is in power, USAID funding for NGOs disappeared. There's a kind of international environment that these regimes feel supported by. So they feel they are on the ascent and their message is sort of gaining ground within the EU. So they want to see what they can get away with. And I guess before I get into the EU reaction, I'd say, the biggest starting point is to understand that the days when we worried that sort of far-right populist or authoritarian-leaning parties would come into power and try to take their countries out of the EU, those days are gone. I mean, if we think back, in the context of Brexit and when we had parties in France, Italy, other states talking like that, there was a lot of worry in many circles that, this could lead to a dissolution of the EU or states, trying to Frexit, Brexit, etc., right? Huxit. Well, I think the message now is that is not the worry. No one wants to leave the EU. That is not the concern. The thing we need to worry about is that these governments, these parties once in power, want to stay in the EU and transform it from within. They want to make the EU a very nurturing and vibrant place for authoritarian member states to coexist happily with other democracies and to get EU funding and have the benefits of membership. So that's the real challenge. Now, as you said, of course, this is very problematic for the countries where it happens. They're losing democratic governance. They're losing the protection of fundamental rights. You're seeing various minorities, whether it's ethnic minorities, sexual minorities, immigrants, being persecuted, fundamental rights being infringed. But in addition to all those problems, there are big fundamental problems for the EU as a structure when this happens. So why? Well, because these regimes inevitably want to poison the EU from within. They're not content to just have their authoritarian practices nationally. They want to infiltrate the EU institutions and sort of spread, like the way a cancer metastasizes. They want to spread into the halls of power in Brussels and Strasbourg. And by the way, this is something, it's not unique to the EU. In a lot of my writing, I've made comparisons with kind of federal systems around the world where you've seen this. Right here in the US, where I'm from, after the Civil War, for instance, we had authoritarian one-party states that practiced a version of sort of racist authoritarianism, oppressing their African-American citizens and having one-party rule by the Democratic Party back then. And it lasted for nearly a century after the Civil War. But they didn't just have authoritarianism in those southern states. They also infiltrated Washington and got their people in positions of power in Congress and in the administration and basically poisoned our democracy at the national level. And that is what people like Orban want to do. They want to put their people into positions of power in the EU institutions. They're already doing that, and infiltrate. So that's a huge problem for the EU. And in fact, I would say it's an even bigger problem for the EU than for any normal state, whether the historic US or other places where this happened, like Argentina or Mexico. It's a bigger problem for the EU because the EU makes a lot of decisions by unanimity. So that means that very often these governments are in the position to block EU policy, to veto foreign policy, the EU budget, etc. And because they're in that position, they can practice extortion, right? So that's what we've seen Orban doing, and that's what we'll see Fico doing, I think, is in the future, is extorting using their veto threat, to get the EU to back off. So we saw Orban in that famous incident about a year ago where he basically extorted the EU into releasing a big tranche of the funding that had been suspended to Hungary in order to get support with some of the foreign policy and budget things on Ukraine. So we'll see more of that. So that's why it's very problematic for the EU. The EU ultimately, it's not a state. It doesn't have a big tax base, an army, a police, or extensive administration. It's basically held together by the rule of law and by the sort of trust that the member states will apply EU law. And so if you actually have autocratic member states that have eliminated judicial independence, then basically the EU ceases to function in those countries. The EU doesn't really function in Hungary anymore because there's no independent judiciary to enforce its laws. And so therefore, for a system like the EU that is so reliant on law and independent judiciaries and the kind of willing cooperation of its member governments, having these autocratic states is deeply problematic. And I guess the one other thing I'd say, just drawing on the work of a professor from University of Kiel, John Cotter, he's pointed out in some very insightful writings that basically having countries that attack their NGOs, their civil society, that undermine democracy the way Hungary and Slovakia are doing, that basically renders the functioning of the EU kind of illegal. Why? I mean, if you read Article 10 of the treaties, it says specifically, member states in the Council, the European Council or the Council of Ministers, must be represented by their heads of government who are themselves democratically accountable to their parliaments and their citizens, or their citizens. Well, so if you have a system where they're no longer accountable in that way, then basically every law passed by the Council is de facto illegal in violation of the treaties. The EU is not allowed legally to have autocratic governments. And maybe I'll finish with this. That, by the way, is the reason that it's very striking that as much criticism as you'll see, from some EU leaders, you'll never hear like the president of the commission or a commissioner say that Hungary is an autocracy. They can't admit it, because if they admitted it, they would admit that the EU is operating illegally. So they'll never say it. And I guess the very last thing I'll say is there have been some, encouraging developments, not maybe from the council or from from the commission, but just the other day we saw the parliament, a letter released. I can put it in the chat. A letter sent by, I think it was 26 members of the European Parliament, calling for an immediate suspension of all EU funds to Hungary. They were picking up on a recommendation that Kim Schepela, John Moraine, and I had written 3 years ago now, in a report for the Greens group in the European Parliament, where we said that all EU funding for Hungary should be suspended. So it's nice to see MEPs from many party groups just the other day backing this idea, because I think ultimately that's the way forward, is suspending funds completely to regimes that are no longer democratic. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dan, for this thought-provoking contribution. And I certainly would like to come back to your point, what you made, that actually the EU already ceased to be operational in Hungary. But before we would go into the Q&A, I think there is still one very important question in the room that we need to answer. And this is that what can be done and what shall be done, actually, by the civil society in Slovakia and in Hungary, EU institutions, potentially fellow member states of these illiberal or autocratizing countries and governments, and potentially also charities, donor organizations, and civil society organizations in the European Union and abroad. What can be done in this case? And I don't know whether any of you has some answer, I think, to this very, very central and pragmatic question. Marti.
So what can be done? Well, first of all, the first point is that what needs to be said is that this kind of restrictions in the European Union that hinder a free and vibrant civil society are unacceptable. And I'm not sure everybody can subscribe to this statement anymore in the European Union. I would certainly hope that the idea that we need citizens, their participation, their engagement with each other, and their watchful eye on power is a precondition for a good democracy. But we see the rollout of restrictive rules and legislation in many, many EU member states. And it appears that a lot of this goes unnoticed or without reaction. But I think it's very, very important to go back to this basic, and this is the fundamental starting point that I think we would like to hear from member states, from governments, from parliaments, not only the European Parliament, but national too, and also, of course, from the European Commission. Beyond this sort of overall statement, I think we see the need to react politically, legally, and also at the operational level. And there are some very, very clear steps, at least as we are thinking about the Hungarian scenario, that the European Commission needs to take now. So in the past 2 weeks, obviously, I think we've moved a little bit the needle from the European Commission for saying, well, this is just a draft legislation and we are not able to comment on it. And I did not even hear an immediate statement of concern to something which is far more closer to the appropriate response, where we've seen the Commission through its spokespeople express utter concern at this legislation. We've heard Commissioner McGrath, who's in charge of basically the justice portfolio, express deep concern about this, and we've heard how the Commission would be ready to use all its legal tools once this law comes into force. And of course, the legal tools in this instant case mean using infringement actions. There will be a new law. The infringement case will have to be prepared so that once this new law is and has entered into force, it goes ahead with full speed. And it's so sad to say, but I really don't think the Commission should spend too much time trying to understand the Hungarian government's legal position, because it's not illegal, it's a political position. So perhaps going through the first steps of the formal notice quite fast, and keeping an eye on the court, and that requesting the court to move fast and also to suspend this law will be extremely important. But that, in any case, in the fastest scenario with the highest political willpower, would take still months. And so we need protection right now, because we're looking at a place where in a couple of weeks, you will not have a lot of independent autonomous entities operate in an EU member state. And so the ongoing legal cases at the Court of Justice also provide opportunities to consider and to request interim measures. And we really are calling for the Commission to look at this. How can the ongoing process, for example, in the 2023 law on the Sovereignty Protection Act, provide a space for interim measures? We believe the Commission can do this, both on the legal and also on the political front, and are hoping it will happen. But also, of course, there are others. So Dan, you mentioned the call for suspension of funding. We also have to see how many mechanisms that relate to how a member state and the European Union spends EU funds can be brought in here in this conversation. So when we have a restriction on civil society space or freedom of association and freedom of the media to such an extent, how can citizens really make sure that EU funding benefits them? How can the Commission know, or other EU bodies know, how EU funds are spent? And for this purpose, the European Union has decided to send up monitoring committees for various EU funding mechanisms. And these, in the Hungarian case, also see civil society organizations participate. So if these organizations are attacked, if they are hindered to the extent of their operations that they can no longer operate in Hungary, how will these funding committees, these funding monitoring committees, do their job? So this, in fact, jeopardizes the right use of EU funds. And this will entail issues under both the common provisions regulations that apply to all EU funding, but also the conditionality regulation. So there is hooks here that relate to other policy objectives of the EU. Also, we've seen how Hungary's, of course, been levied fines by the Court of Justice for failure to implement judgments. And therefore, I think we can't operate on an assumption that the Hungarian government in such an, for them, very important political project would back down. And this will, of course, push Hungary out of the common rule of law space even further. So these preoccupations will mean that perhaps further funding will need to be suspended, or further fines are coming our way. This is something that will take the European Union into, in a way, uncharted territory or untested waters, because of course the legal consequences are one thing, but we have to recognize politically also what's happening. There was a General Affairs Council held yesterday on that also discussed the state of fundamental rights and rule of law in Hungary. And from what we understand, an increasing number of member states are so frustrated with the inability to have an impact and reverse this backsliding, that the discussion is evolving into a direction perhaps that they would have been too timid to discuss. And academics and think tankers have been calling for moving forward with the Article 7 procedure, putting out recommendations to which Hungary, the Hungarian government, should be held accountable to. And if not, consequences should move to the next stage of the process. And I think it seems that the time is so bleak that this might even happen. This is not going to be a happy news for Hungarians. And I think we here in Hungary have to make sure that we also put our voice out and resist this this lurch into Putinism. It's not something Hungarians want. It's not something that is good for us as a society, but it also impacts and hinders the EU from achieving its broader aims too.
Thank you, Martin. Then, Katarina.
Katarina, go ahead.
Thank you very much. I'm thinking on something that wasn't mentioned here, but actually now in Slovakia Parliament is thinking about approving a constitutional change in Slovakia that will, I think, very much bring Slovakia to the Hungarian scenario even closer, because in this constitutional amendment, which is now discussed in Slovak Parliament, is something that the Hungarians well known is the something called national identity. And it is aimed to, to hinder the developments on homosexual couples' rights. Yeah, but as far as it is written now, it is much broader. It can concern also education, healthcare, and cultural space, and so on. So the broad definition of national identity. And based on this amendment, the Slovak Constitutional Court will not allow application of any international commitments or EU commitments within the Slovakia. And this is something that is even, I think, more harmful than the result of the legislation process towards the anti-NGO legislation, because then the Slovak government can open a door to disrespect some of the rules within the EU, or disrespect some of the human rights documents that we ratified and are already implemented in Slovakia. So this is something even more threatened, and I will underline what Marta said, that this is a political decision on the EU level. So the European Union should definitely decide if they want to protect the democratic space, and also protect or push those countries which are leaning towards authoritarian regime to respect the common grounds and respect the common rules and values that we are agreed upon freely when we build the European Union, and when the new countries like Slovakia were accessing the European Union. So this is something that, in my opinion, is a political decision, and the union should decide, because now it is the time when these legal, constitutional and other environments are changing, and I think now is the time to decide if we really are protecting values within the EU, on the EU level and on the national levels, and build the democracy as such within the countries.
Thank you so much. Dan?
Well, I guess I would just back to the central question of what to do about all this. I would just go back to the issue of funding. I know there's some talk of, might Article 7 even finally be invoked, where the voting rights of Hungary or Slovakia, et cetera, could be suspended. I think that's a distraction, really. I think the focus should be all on the money, right? And that is the most powerful tool, the most effective tool. Some might say, oh, well, but they suspended some of Orban's money already, and it didn't cause him to, change path. But I think the answer there is they didn't suspend enough of the money, and they haven't held out long enough, and he's still was able to keep his operation and his whole system of paying off, using EU money, various supporters as in a kind of patronage network. Really, they need to dry up the source of funding, because the current situation is that essentially EU funding functions the way oil functions for sort of petrostates, where you have this resource curse kind of situation where there's this inflow of money controlled by the government. They can use it to distribute to their patronage network to hold, to support, their entire regime. And you need to dry up that source of revenue, because the number one thing is the EU should not be funding autocracy. Okay, you can only really start saying, oh, do we lack tools to do more once you've stopped contributing to the problem, right? For now, they are funding this, right? And I want to add that I think it's very hard for people in these countries. I won't, bring in Marta or Katarina, but, whether you're in the NGO space or opposition politicians, I think particularly, it's very hard for opposition politicians in these countries to advocate for like a total suspension of funds, because that will, of course, hurt regular people. It will hurt the economy. It's very hard to do that. So it's easy for me as an American, far away, to do it. You might say, oh, well, how about the regular people that will suffer? And I feel for that. But honestly, I think the only way to really dislodge these regimes and to make them feel pain is to suspend the funds coming from the EU.
Thank you, Dan. And I wouldn't like to slip in the speaker role, but as much as I agree with you regarding the importance of the funding, I think the talk about Article 7 is more than just disruption. In spite all of the difficulties to conclude Article 7, paragraph 2 with the consent. Because if we consider the need to extend actually the sanctions against Russia already next month, and the extortion capacity of the Hungarian government on that regard, together actually with the geopolitical importance of the sanctions and what could be the implications if the EU would fail on them. And I think it's primarily a strategic action of self-defense that the voting right of the Hungarian government should be suspended. And if actually autocratization and the infringement on fundamental rights and European freedoms, we haven't underlined, but actually the Hungarian law is also a significant violation of the freedom of the free movement of capital within the European Union. So if those arguments were not convincing enough, then they should consider actually that an escalating conflict of the Hungarian government, what sort of geopolitical consequences it could have in light of all of the decisions that are due in the next months and that require unanimity in the Council of the European Union. However, I think we can return actually to all of these political and legal conflicts, but there is also another question asked from the ranks of the audience that actually other players have much more freedom to act. Donors, charity organizations, international civil society partners. What can they do now under the new regulations in Slovakia, in Hungary, not necessarily in a way compliant with the laws, but in a way that may allow a kind of circumvention? How can they continue to support civil society organizations in Slovakia, Hungary? Martin?
So one thing that I think is a sort of a common, long-standing call from civil society organizations around the European Union is that now is the time to recognize that within the EU, we need to replicate the measures that the EU rightly and sometimes even boldly does to protect civil society and human rights defenders outside of the European Union. Of course, there's a lot to discuss about what the EU does outside the EU and its human rights record, obviously, but there are funding mechanisms and other support mechanisms that are in place, but there's nothing in place because we have been, I think, quite for a very long time, continuing the dream that the EU is a space where really we have the highest standards in practice for protection of fundamental rights and actors. And this is absolutely not the case, but the policy response, the measures are still being under discussion. So civil society has been calling for an EU-wide civil society strategy from the Commission that would also entail protective measures, response measures that would have alert mechanisms so that we would know who to call in the Commission when something goes bad. There are similar pretty good examples in other organizations such as the Council of Europe. So the proposal for a civil society strategy is going to be rolled out. I think near the end of the year, the European Commission will put out a proposal, and a consultation will start. So these are the points we would be making, certainly from Hungary. We need emergency measures. We need flexible funding rules, because now it is quite a likely scenario, perhaps an almost certain scenario, that Hungarian organizations that are going to be blacklisted are going to crash out of ongoing EU funding mechanisms. If universities are targeted, they'll crash out of Horizon, those few universities which still have access to it. Civil society organizations working from a wide range of EU funds will not be able to participate for the future, but also they'll lose their access immediately. And for this, we have nothing, no mechanisms, no flexibility. We have no understanding of what happens then. So this has to be thought through, and perhaps just without going through whole, very, very elaborate policy cycles, it can be fixed quite rapidly at an operational level. Probably the tools are there, and we need to the Commission to also address this, but also longer term. Can you imagine that we're looking at a scenario where Hungarian journalists might not be able to carry out their work anymore? We've seen, of course, journalists being in Hungary also being targeted by spyware. It was discovered and then nothing happened. Everybody knows this happened. There were no measures taken to prevent this in Hungary and also in many other EU member states. So what will happen to them? We want Hungarian journalists to do their job in Hungary in Hungarian language, right? We certainly don't want to see a replication of scenarios unfolding in Russia and Georgia. So immediate emergency support is really important. But first of all, I think the bottom line is that this law cannot be allowed to go forward in Hungary. So all our efforts will be concentrated on this.
Thank you so much, Martin. Katarina?
Yeah, we will probably produce an amicus curiae to the Constitutional Court to raise our arguments against this legislation. We will wait for the decision. We will wait for actual application. But what is happening also in Slovakia, besides this legislation, is a cut of public funding, especially to LGBT plus organizations working in culture, organizations working in environmental protection, and also we didn't receive any public funding for the watchdog organization, but there are threats and there are administrative burdens that are pushed on us basically from the beginning of the ruling of the government. So we need support. We need support also financially from abroad because lots of funds and also lots of companies are, withdrawing the support within Slovakia. So really money is something that will help us. We are fighting back. We are very active. We were protesting. We are running campaigns against this legislation, and we are trying to do our best to provide the legal support for organizations in particular cases. Especially from the areas as a legal organization, we are trying to be as helpful as we can and provide support. But this is also this is also a matter of financial support that we can get as an organization, as a platform for democracy operating in this environment. So yes, and also the support from abroad towards the effective and flexible funding from the EU, and also, as Marta said, for the overall strategy of the European Union for protecting the civil society, because we really need to talk about protection that the civil society and freedom within the civil society need, and also the journalists. This is the same in Slovakia. They are attacked by the politicians every day, even though the overall regulation environment for media is more or less free for now. The public media broadcaster was overruled by this government already.
Thank you so much. I would like to come back to 2 points made by Marty. The first one was that actually both EU institutions and donors should actually start implementing similar measures within the EU, what they do actually outside of the EU. And here just one remark. Actually, we have seen a lot of donors pivoting towards the global south over the past couple of years, abandoning democracy promotion within the broader West. And we already touched upon this issue, but I just would like to underline that we are not talking exclusively about Slovakia and Hungary, but we are talking about transnational learning and contagion effect. And I really hate to highlight that just this month, there was a legislative proposal in the US Congress that tried to blacklist actually charity organizations on political grounds in the frame of the reconciliatory budget draft. Meaning that actually not only NGOs, civil society organizations and media organizations in Slovakia or Hungary are targets, but actually all of us can be a target. And pretty much those organizations can be targets as well, to abandon actually working on safeguarding Western democracy. So potentially we should in some way refocus on self-defense without actually abandoning or questioning the importance of democracy work in the global south, because ultimately we are all targets. And coming back to your second point, you mentioned that everything needs to be done to stop the implementation of this law. And I would like to ask back to you and Dan, how it would actually look like if out of the blue and in a fully supported but rather surprising way, the European Commission would really ask the CGEU to impose an interim measure on the implementation of the Hungarian law. Because as Dan mentioned in his introductory note, actually the EU already ceased in some way to operate in Hungary, because the Hungarian courts and other state institutions are not necessarily neutral. Would they implement actually the CGEU ruling? Would they remain compliant with EU law or with the Hungarian legislation? And it's not only a question actually or with regard to the state institutions, it's also a question regarding the legal compliance of all of the financial institutions and banks that need to implement the law and actually monitor the financial accounts of the listed organizations. And I fully agree that it might be actually a test for the resilience of the EU legal order, but it can be a test of the resilience of the authoritarian legal order in Hungary. Because what will the Hungarian government do if, for example, all of the banks operating in Hungary will choose to be compliant with the ruling of the CGEU, not with the Hungarian legislation? So I think it will be a highly interesting, but also very opaque situation. And I don't know what's your analysis and expectation in that regard.
Marta, you want to go ahead?
Yes, but so these questions are for the moment, I think, although they're fundamental, but they're hypothetical, and perhaps so some of the scenarios or situations in Hungary, I think, are a little bit more nuanced. Hungary hasn't crashed out of the EU legal order altogether. Just today, I heard about a judge who turned to the Court of Justice with a preliminary reference request in a case where we thought this would never happen. Not only did the judge recognize that there needs to be clarification about what he should think about EU law that the Hungarian law so much contradicts, but also in a climate where this has been looked on so unfavorably that actually the European Commission in the rule of law milestones had to point out that Hungarian judges should be actually allowed to go forward with preliminary reference requests, and the mechanisms and the structures and the rules should guarantee their freedom to do so. Anyway, so this judge not only was aware, but wanted to act. And we always see individuals who are going to be wanting to act and safeguard. And as I said, it's very clear with this particular law, this is not the kind of sovereignty Hungarians want. They understand European Union membership and the opportunities, both financial, transactional, transnational, and also value-based that come with it completely differently. So there are people who want to do things and everywhere. And we've been working together with many, many partners, civil society organizations for years in Hungary to support this ecosystem. And this ecosystem requires support not only within a country, but transnationally too. Also, I would say now the transatlantic dimension is also extremely important. And so not only have we been working with the partners in Hungary, but also across borders with many European Union-based organizations. I know that some participants in the Recharging Advocacy for Rights in Europe program are actually attending this webinar because not only out of concern and solidarity for partners in Slovakia and Hungary, but because they're so keenly aware that whatever is happening in one country can be very easily copied into another country's legislation and policy and practice in the European Union. It's almost it's an illiberal market too, not only a single market in this sense. And so I think we need to support these actors and their connections. The EU can also do far more for this by nurturing all sorts of connections between societies and civil society organizations, academics, journalists, and also cross-sectoral. So I think we've seen quite in the past 5-10 years, a whole new community come together and connect in various forms, spanning countries and sectors. But at the same time, I see your point, the resistance, the commitment to act and to live in a democracy is fragile when you're faced with propaganda, with disinformation that portrays your reality as full of, I don't know, as if it was a minefield out there, just full of enemies and threats. And there can only be one strong power to protect you. So to counter this, we have perhaps in the EU not spent enough thinking about what to do about our media space. There's a lot of thinking about foreign interference at the moment, but how that is homegrown or imported and then thrown into our media and mind market under a different labeling is perhaps less addressed. And certainly when we talk about rule of law and its actors, I think even the Commission has talked about independent media as one, but there is very little done to support solidarity and resilience and cooperation among journalists. So this is a huge weakness. It renders us quite vulnerable. And I think this is something to address quite forcefully as well. I know I didn't answer your question in full, but let's not go out there when there is no rule of law whatsoever in Hungary and all the actors are gone. I'm certainly not one that would like to go down this path now. But it is a realistic scenario at the moment in a few weeks.
Thank you for the clarification, and I would like to underline it was also not my message. I wanted to make that there are absolutely no actors in Hungary. But on the other hand, even if that's a hypothetical scenario, but we have with the interim measures, I think the policy planning you need to go through to hypothetical scenarios as well. Then you also wanted to chime in.
I guess I would just say this. I think the EU, in its reaction to these developments, needs to focus, let's say, more on strategy and less on the minutia of tactics, right? I think the EU has been losing this battle with the autocratic forces in Hungary and Slovakia, elsewhere, partly because they've been too reactive. They've been sort of caught up in this, what people often call in Orban's case, this kind of peacock dance where they, take some step after sort of agonizing of what to do and which tools to use and wasting time developing new tools. Then they take a step and then the governments just play them. They say, oh, okay, we'll make a little reform. And then a few months later, they change it, et cetera. And basically in doing this little dance of tactics, they just keep losing because these regimes are much clearer about their long-term strategy, which is to consolidate authoritarian rule, to do it using EU funding, et cetera. Well, the EU needs to be equally clear and definitive, right, in its overarching decisions of, okay, we are not going to fund autocracy anymore, right? And we will do whatever it takes to achieve that. And so, yeah, for instance, now with this new law, okay, there's questions. Oh, should we bring an infringement? Well, we have to wait for the law to pass and, et cetera, et cetera. They shouldn't wait for anything. They should take interim measures under existing infringements that are already open, like on the Sovereignty Protection Authority. They should go back to fund suspensions that they've already triggered and expand those. And they should just say, basta, enough, right? No more peacock dance, no more games. Your gravy train is dried up.
Thank you so much. We are slowly approaching the end of the webinar, and I think we have time for a last lightning question and lightning answer. And the question is, what could civil society organizations do to make corporate players more engaged in providing support to them? If that's still possible in the light of the U-turn a couple of corporate players just already achieved and on their diversity, equality, and inclusion programs over the past couple of months. I don't know whether Katarina or Marty, you have any thoughts on how could civil society make corporate players more engaged?
I will be a little bit open, I think, for this, because we have lots of international companies operating in Slovakia. And sometimes what we encounter is that if we are dealing with the local businesses who understands the Slovakian situation and situation in civil society in Slovakia, they are more willing to get engaged and to support the NGOs which are which have the bad label of being involved in protecting of the civil society space, who are on the front line, who are attacked by the politicians. But from the international companies, which had headquarters in Germany, in other EU countries, they are less likely to get involved in this protecting of civil society, protecting the rule of law issues, and to support organizations which are engaged in this, not so directly charitable activities from the civil society, but which are needed in these times very much in Slovakia. So maybe the overall European Union support should not always come only from the diplomatic ways, but also from the companies which are investing in Slovakia from other EU countries. We are very much linked. We are very open economic, and a lot of the international companies operate within Slovakia. And I think I don't know if it is that the other corporate actors do not care if the space in Slovakia and Hungary is really democratic, really operating in a clear rule of law lines and protection of the civic space, media freedom, and so on, or if they don't care, or if they are just more frightened to get their businesses compromised by this engagement. But I think it is our common European responsibility to protect the space, not only in my country, not only in Germany, not only in the headquarters or headquarter countries of these international companies, but also on the other countries with which they're invest in, actually, because it is clear from the Georgia example that if the space, the operating space for this company is clear, based on rule of law and democratic principles, the businesses are more protected, actually, and more willing to grow within this space than under authoritarian regimes, which are not so predictable, which are not so open to protect the investments of these companies, actually.
Thank you so much. I think we shouldn't end with bleak conclusions. So potentially, I would like to underline that I saw some silver lining actually in the contributions, and the silver lining was highlighted by Marty, and that was actually individual agency. So as long as we have individual judges having the courage to start preliminary ruling procedures, as long as we have individual donor organizations providing lifeline support for Hungarian and Slovak CSOs, even if it's not according to the letter of the national legislation in these countries, as long as we have national governments building majorities in the EU Council to condemn authoritarian measures in fellow member states, like we had the case with the Dutch government and the letter of the 20 member states in the Article 7 or related to the Article 7 procedures, then I think there is still hope and there is silver lining. And I think we should take this message of individual agency from this highly engaging discussion, for which I am absolutely indebted and grateful to you all. So Katarina, Marty, Dan, thank you so much. I hope this was not the last time that we had such a conversation, even if I think you would agree with me, Marty, that based on the legal analysis of the Hungarian law, this conversation would qualify to be blacklisted. But notwithstanding this, ladies and gentlemen, also thank you for being with us today. If you are interested in our European democratic security related work or regional work in Central and Eastern Europe, please follow our social media accounts. Please follow the social media accounts of Via Juris, the Hungarian Helsinki Foundation, and share their really crucial analysis to the situation in these two countries now. And I wish you a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for hosting this important conversation, and all the best to all of you and also the audience.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me, and take care.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation.
Thank you. Bye.